Hello, and welcome to episode 87 of the Sci-Fi Podcast from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Eleanor Knox, reader in philosophy of physics at King's College London, and currently the senior visiting fellow in the Center for Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. Much of Eleanor's work focuses on the foundation of spacetime physics. Eleanor advocates a view she calls Spacetime Functionalism, which she thinks solves problems in classical theories as well as dealing with the challenges to standard accounts raised by emergent spacetime structures in theories of quantum gravity. Eleanor is also interested in relationships between theories. She's argued that the kinds of novelty that seem to be involved in cases that physicists call emergent is explanatory novelty, arising from particular kinds of changes of variables between theoretical description. Before taking up permanent lectureship at King's and later visiting here in Pittsburgh, Eleanor was a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow. Before that, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Philosophy in the University of London, and before that she studied at Oxford University. In 2015, she received the Cushing Memorial Prize for History and Philosophy of Physics. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Eleanor. Dr. Eleanor Knox, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Monday morning?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for being willing to come on. So you're calling us from a very close space at the Center for Philosophy of Science. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I am here for the year as the senior visiting fellow, which is great.
Well, wonderful. No, that's wonderful. Well, congratulations, and obviously Pittsburgh. The center, I'm sure, is very, very happy to have you. So we're about 6 or 7 weeks into the term. How have things been at the center? Is this your first time visiting? Tell us a little bit about how this is coming to be.
It's my first time visiting the center. It's my second time working in Pittsburgh. I did a visiting professorship here.
Oh, wow!
2013 for a semester. So I've done a semester of kind of properly working at Pittsburgh, which was amazing and wonderful. And John Norton was the center director at the time, and he let me kind of pretend to be a fellow, and that was kind of fun. But I was also teaching, and now this is my first time being at the center with the full luxury of just thinking about research and having fun conversations. And so, yeah, it's wonderful. It's a dream job. I wish I could do it all the time, but
just paid to
real life beckons.
Just get paid Just get paid to think, to do the best research, to be hanging around, but to spending as much time as you can with other bright individuals. It's really something special. It's crazy, like the way it's set up. It's like you have the department, and then right across the hall is the center, and there's just always something going on. There's so many talks. There's always people discussing. There's just this. It's like really unlike it. There are a few other centers like this, but it's really something really special.
I think the center in particular is really extraordinary, because I think you bring in a whole bunch of people who are only somewhere to do research, and you get this really special environment, because obviously people are busy in their normal jobs. But if you have a kind of core of 8 or 9 people who are always there, and then everyone else, and then this amazing research community that's sort of popping in and out and busy and have their classes or whatever, you end up with just, I think something that I'm not aware of really happening anywhere else in the world. So it is.
So as a fellow, what are your responsibilities? What could you tell us a little bit about how it's structured? So once you apply, or perhaps as a senior fellow, you might be invited. I'm not sure how it works, but then, for this year or for a term, what are the opportunities you get to have?
Yeah, so I mean, the job, such as it is all you have to do is show up to things and be in your office, which is actually wonderful for me, because I have small children, and being told that I have to be in my office, which I don't do enough of in London, is actually wonderful. Right. And I feel like I should go home and start insisting on only working in my office, because it's brilliantly undisturbed. But yeah, so mostly the job is just to be here, to talk to people. I need to organize a conference, give a couple of talks. but really that's the whole gig, just to be around and be engaged in the intellectual community. So
Wonderful.
Let's say dream job.
Wonderful. Well, we'll get to talk about this and talking about this as organizing a conference. Is that something? So is that something the senior fellow typically does? Is bringing?
Yes. So one of the senior fellows' jobs is to organize a conference in the spring. So I'll be organizing one on my kind of project at the moment, which is about spacetime functionalism, bringing a bunch of people here to talk about that. So that should be really fun as well.
Well, we'll get it. Okay. Well, I'm very excited to hear about the story, how you got into philosophy of science, talking about philosophy of physics, particularly related to space-time. So let's start back at the beginning and learn a little bit about you. So tell us, Eleanor, where did you grow up?
So I'm a closet American. My accent doesn't show it, but I'm a dual national. But I was born in Colorado Springs, and I lived there till I was 6.
This is the first time I've heard that term, but I could understand
thank you. It happens particularly right now when I'm in America that people are incredibly surprised that I am in fact American.
Sure.
The accent
it's usually the other way around for something. Well, I mean, yeah, sure, makes sense. Okay, my first 6 years of my life were in Colorado Springs, and then I spent 2 years actually in Wales, so in the UK, and then moved back to New Hampshire, where I spent in some ways the rest of my childhood, although then I went to boarding school in the UK. So I'm an Atlantic Ocean hopper. That's my fair enough.
main identity.
So Colorado Springs, so a mix of okay. So what did you find yourself well, I guess, what was that like going back, being exposed to the US and the UK system growing up?
So I think in lots of ways it was good. I think, moving as a kid is always
that's
mildly traumatic in its own ways, but I think very character forming. I've been thinking about this lots, having brought my own daughters over to the States and transplanted them into the American school system and made them leave home. And for this year, it's made me think a lot about what my childhood was actually like. And I think lots of it was challenging and difficult, and it instilled in me a deep dislike of anything that looks anything close to nationalism, because I was always foreign. The British always thought I was American, and the Americans always thought I was British, and I was always the foreign kid in my class wherever I went. And I sort of so I developed kind of a visceral dislike of kind of nationalistic boundaries, and I'm deeply anti-patriotic in both my countries. Patriotism is too close to nationalism for me. So I think that was quite a kind of there was a one of our many British prime ministers recently, Theresa May, said once that if you thought you were a global citizen, you were a citizen of nowhere, and that's kind of like that's a sort of life to the heart for someone like me. I fancy myself as very much a kind of a wanderer. Yes.
I think I don't think. Well, I'm wondering, who do you think? Well, okay, fair enough. I feel like, I guess there's I'm not sure. Would you consider, is there an equal level of patriotism or nationalism between US or UK, or do you think one takes, maybe it kind of depends where you go in the US, I would say, because
I used to think that America was much more patriotic and nationalistic in its own ways. I think that the two countries are incredibly different in the way they do it. And I think part of the whole kind of Brexit mess that's played out in the UK has shown the dark side of British nationalism and patriotism and xenophobia in ways that I think once upon a time I thought were less of an issue in the UK. But now I have a slightly darker view of both countries than I did 5 years ago.
I think you're not alone with these sentiments. But having lived the lived experience of being kind of an odd person out in certain instances has got to motivate, fuel that a little bit.
The enterprises like the European Union are the kind of thing that if you felt a little bit foreign your whole life, something that's a kind of a big national multinational interaction feels like the kind of thing the world ought to be doing, and it's sad to see the world doing less of it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so a lot of experience been in both places, but so what were you interested in growing up? What did you So, as a small child, I was pretty much just a bookworm.
who knows if that's a reaction to bumping around schools or what, but
Sure.
but I think most of my memory of early childhood is just being curled up in a corner with a book. I have a big noisy family. I mean, three of us, but we're loud.
You're loud.
And
Yeah.
and I was famously just, no one could ever get my attention because I was so deep in a book that I had no idea what was going on. So a lot of my childhood, I think, was lived out through the kind of fantasy medium of novels.
Sure. So like fiction, particular fiction novels you were interested in and things like that.
Yeah. So I think probably still somewhat true, although I read so much less than I used to. Sci-fi, fantasy, anything. Escapism,
fun.
Pure escapism.
Escapism. Anything that would take you out of the current situation. I get it. I feel like this is a common. Not as maybe it's a little bit more. Definitely there's a amongst philosophers, I think, and folks. It's just reading is a big thing, but then fiction and it's very common amongst ourselves to enjoy, to be able to kind of zone in on something as we do it in our own research eventually. But okay, so all right, well, so tell us a little bit about what did you want to do when you grew up? How did things in terms of, I imagine, what was sort of some thoughts of were there pressures of doing what were there family pressures to do certain things, or did you have particular interest to do against that? Like, what was going on?
I think in some ways there was family pressure, but I was the child that lived up to all of it. So I was very academic. I loved school. Mm-hmm. I liked, getting stuff right. And my parents were both teachers.
Okay.
But my dad had kind of dabbled with wanting to go into academia, and it hadn't been practical for him. I have an older half sister. He had a child very young at the stage where he would have been doing a PhD and things, and felt he had to support his family. So my dad, in some ways, is a frustrated academic, and so there was a lot of kind of glamorization of intellectualism and academia in my family. And my parents were both English teachers, and they would talk endlessly about literature and novels at the dinner table. So I was the kid who was most academic in the family. So that was a kind of easy slot to fill into. And that's something I enjoyed. And I liked school. That was always, I got on with it. I got on with my personality, gets on well with academic systems, and which is not true of all people who go on to be academics, right? There's plenty of people who are super smart who don't gel with the way schools teach and the way they interact. But I was lucky, and that kind of did really work for me. So I don't know. I wanted to do so many things. I would, when I was a kid, and I picked on all kinds of careers. And the funny thing is that I never thought that I would be an academic. That wasn't, despite the.
Interesting.
So I thought I would. I was certainly going to go to university, and there were certain things in my family you wouldn't consider not doing. But academia came as a surprise, in a sense that was really what I wanted. I think when I went to university, I thought I wanted to join the Foreign Office and be a diplomat. That's part of the transatlantic childhood. I thought I'd been a terrible diplomat. I'm not particularly diplomatic. But I loved, and I'm not even very good at languages, but I loved the idea of
that's a kind of career you can, it's a career that can be romanticized in not the necessarily similar ways, but it's this kind of, I would just say it's something that it's a career somewhat in mystery, but somewhat in also, just the opportunities that it allows, a bit of prestige in a particular kind of way. So I could see that. Okay. All right. Well, so considering a number of different things, we don't know what we want to do, but so you went on to study. So it looks here like you had the opportunity to study at Oxford. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So I ended up, in a sense, it's the easiest way to become a philosopher of physics, right? Because you do some training in physics and philosophy. So I did the undergrad course in joint honours physics and philosophy at Oxford. So for your American listeners, the UK system, you have to choose your subject when you're like 17 and you're applying to college. Your majors are all predetermined. And so it's a really big question when you're kind of 15, 16, what are you going to study at university? Not just which university are you going to go to, but exactly what you're going to to study. And in fact, you make decisions when you're 14 that determine what you can study at university, because you choose your subjects for your final 2 years of high school. And I loved everything, and I loved maths, and I loved physics, and I also loved kind of literature and or essay-based subjects. And so mostly I was just pretty confused about how to find a degree that let me keep on doing both those things. And I happened on physics and philosophy, not because I had all these great interests in foundations of physics, but because somebody said, oh, you know what, if you want to do physics and you really like, engaging with literature and writing essays, which doesn't obviously seem like philosophy now to me, you should try this degree at Oxford. They have it. You should apply for it. And that seemed like a good idea. So off I went.
All right. So what was it like, I guess, when you were studying, what were things like in terms of, so was this, the physics and philosophy, was it engaged very primarily with, general philosophy of science concerns? Or was this more of a, how did it, what was it like at the time?
Yeah, so the Oxford undergrad degree is actually, I think, pretty special. I've done a lot of work trying to make our King's, we have a joint honours physics and philosophy degree at King's, and I've spent some time making it more like the Oxford degree because I think it works really well. So you're doing a chunk of all the theoretical physics in a physics course, and you're doing a chunk of the philosophy. I mean, Oxford only does joint honours philosophy degrees, so that's kind of well set up. But then what you have is a kind of a yearly course in philosophy of physics. So they start with the Leibniz-Clark correspondence in your first year, and then you do what they call intermediate philosophy of physics, and you go on to do advanced philosophy of physics. So you have, you're in this huge university in big cohorts of kind of physics. And
Is this undergrad or grad? Or
yeah, so this is all undergrad.
This is really something. Yeah, because I don't. This might be the first time I've ever heard of a concerted. This is something you might eventually do at a PhD program, and on your own almost. And this is this is really something.
Yeah. So I think these degrees are great for training people, as I say, in sort of, if you want to be a philosopher of physics, this is pretty much the best undergraduate training you could do in it. So you go and you have a small cohort of maybe 20 people a year max who are doing the joint honours physics and philosophy program, and they're having these lovely seminars from the Oxford Research Group, who are great. So when I was an undergrad, it was Harvey Brown and Simon Saunders and Jeremy Butterfield, and then I think Oliver Pooley was hired. Just about round about when I was doing my undergrad. Chris Timpson, they were there by the end of it, certainly. But so you had this great group of philosophers of physics, many of whom are still in Oxford, and they're teaching 2-on-1 tutorials to you as an undergrad in philosophy of physics, as well as these small classes. So it's quite an intensive undergrad training well before you get to graduate work. And it's thanks to that training that I became a philosopher of physics, because I was enormously surprised and delighted as to how interesting I found, very specifically, the intersection. I hadn't gone into the degree to do philosophy of physics. But that was the bit of everything that I was best at, that came most naturally to me, that I found most interesting, all of the rest of it. So it became apparent somewhere sort of 2/3 of the way through my undergrad that I didn't really want to stop thinking about this stuff. And
so there's a thought,
someone give you money to do it, that would be amazing.
So you're like, I can keep going. Well, fantastic. So what, I guess, what kind of, do you recall, what kinds of questions were you interested in? What kinds of things at the time were motivating to you, or that you hope to maybe learn more about, or, kind of an intellectual history of sorts? Is there anything that you can, I don't know, was there an undergraduate honors thesis or something like that?
Yeah. So I did an undergrad thesis in philosophy of spacetime. So I wrote on the clock hypothesis and special relativity, and thinking about accelerating clocks, very influenced by Harvey Brown, his kind of interests and what he was doing. And that is, and very much that ends up being the jumping off point for a lot of them future research, because again, how the UK system works is quite different from the US. You have to start doing research very quickly in your graduate career. You don't have the kind of 2 years of coursework where you can kind of explore your interests. So,
right.
I went on to do the Oxford BPhil, which is a 2-year master's, but then I had to be writing, I needed a proposal for a dissertation for that, and I needed to be writing a dissertation during that. And then, so it was very much that kind of, that strand of space-time stuff is what I got into as an undergrad, and then kind of continued doing throughout my graduate work.
Fantastic. Well, so tell us a little about your graduate study. So had decided this is what you wanted to keep doing. So what were things like in graduate school?
Well, I mean, again, I think I was very lucky. I don't think I took a year out between undergrad and graduate, and I went and taught in a Zambian high school for the year, because I just thought, well, if I'm going to stay in academia, I better go do something interesting now.
Fair enough.
And so I applied to graduate school.
What was that like, by the way? What was it like teaching in Zambia?
Oh, it was wonderful. I mean, very eye-opening in lots of ways. Taught me a lot about not being overly idealistic about charity and what you could achieve, but it was just a wonderful country. I love Africa. It's deeply, of all the places that I've done a fair bit of travel, but of all of the kind of more adventurous places I've traveled to, there are big chunks of sub-Saharan Africa that have this sort of deep rhythm and kind of life to them that I just think is extraordinary. And I loved the culture. The people were wonderful. The whole thing was, really eye-opening. As I say, eye-opening in other ways too. We did all this idealistic stuff. We tried to build a library because they had all these books that had been donated by well-meaning Americans, and they were all locked in a room because they were worried that the kids would steal them if they let them use them.
Geez.
And so we built a library and set up a borrowing system for the children, so they could borrow the books from the library, just like a basic, like old-fashioned card system. And I went back to the school a year later, and there were a whole bunch of the books had been stolen, so they had just locked the library and no one had opened it for like 6 months.
Wow.
And I had raised all the money to build, to buy the breeze blocks, and got all the local people to build the library. Everyone was really excited, and termites got into the library, and the books had just all been eaten. And it was
literally eaten.
It was such, and likewise, I took out a load of computers and started a computing room at the school. But of course, there was no one to maintain the computers or fix them. It was it was a really good lesson in how much infrastructure and support you need to do things in environments that don't automatically have that infrastructure and support. So many well-meaning people in the school I was in, and the teachers were fantastic, and it wasn't, there was no sort of blame or fault or malice, but it was so hard to just establish something that was a lasting change or a lasting resource in an environment where there wasn't the infrastructure to support those resources. So it gave me a lot of respect, actually, for, I think, institutionalized charities and big charities that have the infrastructure to do good work, and a love of Africa, and a slight adjustment of some of my starry-eyed ideals about how a do-gooder could go out and do some good in the world.
How does it? So, I mean, you mentioned, you kind of prefaced that, and I think you provided a really nice explanation of what that illustrated. I mean, is there something, if you're in terms of wanting to do good or connect in meaningful ways? I mean, how has that shifted how you would approach these kinds of things, or is it more just like a perspective shift of understanding the limits of what one can do or what certain groups can do?
Yeah, so I think it would make me. I mean, it's changed where I might give money if I were giving money to causes. So, right. So for example, I think things that are very simple work really well. So, I mean, people who have thought hard about this kind of charity know these things, that, deworming initiatives, things that really just, make people healthier, right? Really straightforward, relatively easy to instantiate are really good initiatives. And then also gave me a lot of respect for, people like to roll their eyes about big charities and worry about how much their budget is on admin and all of the rest of it. And it made me think, very hard about the fact that something like UNICEF was doing amazing work in the community I was in, because they were big enough and lasting enough and had the infrastructure to bed in for 10 years. And it made me realize that these, behemoth charities that sometimes I think people think are kind of, too big or too bloated or not efficient ways of giving.
They're not necessarily using the money in the best.
Yeah, but they have this ability to do, you have to have something that big to really, or somebody who's going to go and live there for 30 years and make a difference. But But I mean, I think a lot of people who weren't, naive 21-year-olds would have known this, but it's certainly true that a couple of kids can't show up and help a community in any long-term way without an infrastructure behind them.
Fair enough. Well, thank you for sharing about that experience. I'm glad you had to have it. Well, tell us a little bit about, in between there. So returning to, it sounds like, but having, I imagine, a quite different, a new experience, continuing and studying at Oxford. Perhaps, tell us a little bit about your time, and then a little bit about how you came to do your dissertation. So, how you formed your, tell us a little bit about, in just sort of a general sense, like what it was about, what it was reacting to, what you ultimately came to say.
Yeah, so I got sidetracked by that story. What I was going to say is that I was really lucky because I was applying to graduate school from like an internet cafe in Zambia.
Oh, wow.
And so I confess I only ever put in one grad school application, which was short. I just never got around to doing any others. So I applied to one grad school, got in, and that was enormously lucky. And I wanted to stay in the UK. I thought about going to the States, but I had personal reasons to want to stay in the UK. And
sure.
If you were doing philosophy of physics, Oxford was a very obvious place to stay. So that was nice and easy. And I did the BPhil, which is Oxford's 2-year master's program, which is a little bit more like a US program. So you do a lot of coursework, which was really helpful. They make you do a historical option, which I was so grouchy about at the time, but I ended up studying Kant with Adrian Moore, and that's actually been one of the more unexpectedly useful and fruitful things that I've ever done. Yeah, so I think, I didn't have much ability for or appreciation of exegetical work in history, and I think it was really important for me to get that. But also, I think, a lot of the philosophy of physics I do has a sort of Kantian edge to it. I think a lot of the puzzles that one puzzles about when one's trying to think about the physics of the unobservable and how on earth we can get a handle on on this when we only have access to the kind of manifest image. I think that there's a kind of deep connection with kind of Kantian puzzles that I'm glad I had the training in. I don't kind of call myself a neo-Kantian philosopher, but I think that a lot of what one grapples with in the relationship between epistemology and metaphysics that one has to grapple with to do very obscure philosophy of physics of the kind that we can't observe, I think is grappling with the same problems that Kant was grappling with.
That's really interesting. I've had other folks on who have discussed, especially those like who have really appreciated their more traditional history of philosophy training. But they don't have, and they're not necessarily folks who are working in that discipline now. They're, working in general philosophy of science, but they've really appreciated that. And so it sounds to me like, is that something where you were making the connections in real time, like not direct connections, but kind of this, I don't know, like what, or is it? I don't think I was meant. No,
I to say I hated it is too strong a word. But I did. I didn't hate. I had these wonderful supervisions with Adrian Moore. It was the summer term, and we would like sit out on the grass in like an Oxford college and talk about you shouldn't hate that experience, but
it does sound very I get the
image. It was all very Oxford, and Adrian Moore, who's like a wonderful Kant scholar, was such a good teacher of this stuff. But I hated reading Kant. I found the whole thing difficult and painful in a way that I hadn't found philosophy difficult and painful. Because I've mostly avoided the kind of philosophy that's really difficult and painful to read.
Sure.
So it's only in retrospect that I realized that was such a positive experience intellectually, because painful things often are.
They do pay off. Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, great. Well, tell us a little bit about your project and how it came to be, and what you found interesting about it.
Yeah. So I went on to do my BPhil dissertation and then my PhD in space-time stuff. So to be fair, in some ways, slightly unoriginally, I think you can see my PhD research and a lot of what I've done since as the product of having had 2 PhD supervisors, one of which was Harvey Brown, who has...
Yeah, tell us a little bit about you've mentioned them, and so who are they, what are they up to? how they shape.
So I was supervised for the first part of my project by Harvey Brown, whose kind of main thing has been this kind of dynamical approach to space-time theories. It's kind of a fairly kind of metaphysics-light idea that space-time is really grounded in the way that you think about the dynamics of physics theories. And it's very persuasive if you're exposed to a lot of it, but Harvey's very historical and very physics-based and doesn't tend to kind of approach the metaphysical arguments kind of full on. So in some ways, his project, I think, has been sometimes misunderstood, and sometimes it's been hard for people to understand if they're coming from kind of a very kind of metaphysics of space-time view. So I think a lot of people who've worked under Harvey have found the project very tantalizing, and the prospect of trying to explain it in a way that would make contact with some of the opposing views, I think has been kind of an interesting project. So I was involved in that, and then I was also supervised by David Wallace, who has been a huge influence on me, who has a very particular way of thinking about kind of, I think, physics more broadly, and how to think about how various structures can kind of arise from physics, which I think sort of the project he's still working on. And so in some ways, my PhD dissertation, which had the kind of first thoughts that I had about this view, Spacetime Functionalism, was very much taking David Wallace, who thinks a lot about Dennis and sort of Dennettian style functionalism, and marrying it with Harvey Brown's dynamical view. And in many ways, I've been working out the details of that for years since, and sort of started that in my PhD thesis.
So by combining these two, so for those who might not study philosophy of physics, what does combining these particular views allow us to do, or provide some kind of new understanding or way of thinking about space-time?
Good. So there was this in some ways, very helpful thought I had, and a very naive thought as I was sort of finishing up my PhD and applying for postdocs, which was philosophers had just started noticing that physicists talked a lot about emergent spacetimes, and they had started talking a lot about. So people had just sort of started realizing that physicists were talking about spacetime in these kind of slightly surprising ways. So, the kind of really traditional metaphysics of space-time view is like space-time's like the container, it's like the thing we all live in, it's the background for physics, it's the arena in which physics plays out. You'll find all these kinds of phrases. But if you've got physicists playing with theories where space-time doesn't look anything like a fundamental container or the thing where everything lives, and it seems as if that should be kind of ripe ground for philosophers to try and think about what on earth space-time could be, such that these theories could even make sense, or are, perhaps if you really thought that everything has to have a kind of fundamental container and physicists are playing with theories that don't, you have to reinterpret those theories, or those theories are bad in some way. I mean, I think few philosophers would want to make quite that strong normative claim, but there seemed to be a big puzzle here about sort of emergent space-time and quantum gravity. And so part of the thought was that one thing that's sort of tempting about Harvey Brown's view is that it was a kind of view of space-time where space-time was actually something that kind of came out of the dynamics and the behavior of bodies. So it's not exactly relationism of the old Machian, Leibnizian relationism, but it has something in common with it. It then looks very different when you get to general relativity and has less in common with it, I think. So there's it wasn't quite a relationist view. There's something right about thinking that way. And then the thought, so my thought was that actually what's really going on here is that it's not so much that there's no such thing as space-time where it reduces to the relations between bodies, but it's more that when you're interpreting a theory, the thing that you'll end up treating as calling space-time structure is whatever it is in your theory that behaves in a certain kind of way. It governs dynamics in a certain kind of way. And perhaps that thing could be instantiated by non-fundamental structures. It could be instantiated by relations between bodies. It could be, but what the right way to think about theories to interpret them fruitfully was to be looking for pieces of structure that functioned in particular ways. Not to be saying there has to be like a manifold of points, or like not to bring kind of some metaphysical pre-theoretic conceptions to what the space-time would have to look like, but to say, look, I'm really looking for a bit of structure that functions a certain way, and that's the thing that's going to tell me about time and distances and all the stuff I associate with space-time. So that's the thought. There's a lot of work to kind of make that sensible or flesh it out and explain what kind of functionalism that is. But you can see there's a kind of functionalist reasoning.
Absolutely. No, it's fascinating to me. I think you've done a really good job explaining the ways in which, I mean, this to me gives you a really particular picture of like especially from myself coming from like a cognitive science and working with like theories of functionalism as it relates to like models of the brain. It just makes sense. It's like I see a lot of the kind of thinking is just similar, just to a similar kind of object, a different kind of set of theories. So, and that's really interesting. So, well, great. So then how, so you doing this project, what came next in your professional career? What happened next?
So after my PhD, I got a postdoc. Again, I'm not a very good guide for sort of any like graduate student listeners in so many ways, because I've been kind of really sporadically lucky. It's not like I've been offered 1,000 jobs in my life, but all the jobs I ever got offered were in London, which was really useful. So I lived in London through my PhD. I'm not meant to, by the way. They could take away my DPhil at Oxford for that. There's a residency requirement, but I secretly lived in London throughout my PhD and commuted to Oxford because my the boyfriend, now husband, was living there, and I didn't really want to try and relive my undergrad days, and I kind of Oxford, a particular kind of intense, weird university town. So I kind of treated my PhD like a job, got on the bus every day, commuted to work, worked really well for me. But I was living in London, and I was entirely prepared to move anywhere in the world. I knew that I didn't get to be fussy about where I lived. But then as it happened, I applied to a handful of postdocs. I was only 2 years into my PhD, so which you don't spend as long on in the UK, and I'd done this 2-year master's, but I was fairly early, and I could have easily spent a while longer on the PhD, and I started applying for convenient jobs. And one of them was a job in London at the Institute of Philosophy, which is in Senate House in the centre of London. It's this kind of amazing Art Deco building that they use for so many films. I'm always spotting it in films. It's quite funny. It's used for like sort of strange kind of, science fiction films to to James Bond, to everything else. But yeah, so the Institute of Philosophy is this kind of cross-London institute, which had at the time been given a donation by a donor called Shamil Chandaria, who said they wanted to fund a postdoc. And I was the one and only ever Chandaria postdoctoral fellow. I don't know if I put Shamil Chandaria off giving money to future postdocs, or he just realized it was very expensive. But so I got this 2-year postdoc where I got to do research in London and stay where I was living, and that was wonderful.
Wonderful. So, you mentioned that your particular, with your thesis, you still had a lot to work out. Is that during this time? Was this continuing to work out? Kind of what it is you had set up to do. How did things go about it during this time?
Good. So I don't know if I knew how much more I had to do on that at the time. I don't know if that was obvious to me.
Fair enough.
In a way that it is in retrospect.
Sure.
This goes back to this sort of what I think of as quite a helpful but very naive thought that I had, which was I should understand what emergent spacetimes and quantum gravity involve.
Gotcha.
And so I thought, well, I kind of understand what I think about spacetime, but maybe I should work out what I think the word emergent means.
Oh, okay.
That was something that I had during that postdoc. So I started doing work on. I had another postdoc after that, which was a 3-year Leverhulme-funded postdoc. And so I wrote various grant applications, and they would all say things like, in year 1, I will work out space-time. In year 2, I will work out emergence.
Yeah.
It's brilliant. And in year 3, I'll tell you how it works in quantum gravity.
Okay.
That's the kind of funding application I would put in like that. Clearly, I made it a bit more plausible than that because people gave me funding. But as I say, the kind of the naivete in those levels of project just cracks me up in retrospect. I knew it wasn't realistic at the time, but you have to make it sound really good and complete, and you'll bring all these strands together when you write a grant application. So my first postdoc was spent really just trying to work out what I thought about intertheoretic relations. So kind of a bit of a shift away from space-time stuff, although I wrote some stuff applying it to space-time, and just, yes, sort of went deep into, what do I think about, take away space-time, what do I think about how, thermodynamics and statistical mechanics relates? What do I think about these kind of puzzles in physics about different levels of structure? But we understand theoretical relations quite well, but there's some really weird things that happen when we're moving between theories that people think betoken what philosophers of physics would call emergence, which is often much, much lighter than what people might mean by it in mind, etc. But sort of interesting novelty in theories. When do you have kind of interesting novelty or autonomy of a new level of structure? And of course, that project was not a quick one-year project.
Right.
It took on a life of its own. So what ended up happening is there's sort of two strands of my research, one of which is thinking about the ways in which, certainly in mathematized theories, the variable changes and the way that abstractions between theories can lead to kind of explanatory novelty of a particular kind. And that's sort of been going on in parallel to my space-time stuff, although the two are actually intimately related because there's sort of two parts of the thing I want to understand, which is, I want to understand how space-time can be something non-fundamental, and I want to understand how anything can be something non-fundamental, if that makes sense, and the two things feed into one another. But I haven't got a perfect thesis about emergent spacetimes and quantum gravity, and we're many years on from those claims and applications.
No, well, I'm starting to get a picture of how you approach particular problems, and particularly maybe at this time in postdoc, it was very much, working things out piecemeal, and then kind of the thought would be to kind of bring them together in some ways, and really, if you're going to understand this, we need to understand this. I'm curious. So at this time, though, working in postdoc, who were who were the other individuals with whom you're either responding with or studying? Was this so? In the way you work on these problems, is this something where you're spending most of your time with philosophers of physics? Are you working or connecting with physicists or philosophers that maybe from another kin, but then applying those kind of concepts to then bringing those ideas and bringing them over to philosophy of physics? Who did you spend time with, and who were you motivated by and responding to, reading, things like that? Good.
So in my PhD, I was probably spending more time interacting with and writing about physicists. So a lot of my kind of earlier work was really about physics papers. I'd find a suggestive physics paper and really try and understand it.
Right.
I think I then moved into something that's probably more explicitly philosophical after that. So the Institute of Philosophy, it's very much not a philosophy of science institute. It can be philosophers from anywhere. There were a lot of philosophers of mind and cognitive science coming through. So that was something I was talking to people about a lot. There were people doing really hardcore logic and metaphysics. But, so a lot of what people I was interacting with at the time were people bringing kind of slightly non-philosophy of physics perspectives. But because of the project I was working on at that stage, that was incredibly helpful. There's plenty of physics in the project of entity-theoretic relations, but there's a lot of just trying to work out what you think philosophically about certain kinds of broader philosophy and metaphysics issues as well. So I had a wonderful set of postdocs in the institute with me. So Adam Colton, who's a philosopher of physics, he's now at Oxford, was a postdoc at the same time as me. Nick Jones, who's logic and sort of hardcore logic, language and metaphysics, was in the institute with me. But it was a lovely. We all shared an office. We spent a lot of time. I probably wrote less and spent more time talking about philosophy than I should have. But that was really enjoyable. And London, of course, is. Actually, London's too big and people get fragmented. But I was much better when I was a postdoc and I wasn't busy. There was unimaginable numbers of talks going on, loads of philosophy of physics, actually. LSE's got a big department, people at UCL.
Right.
At the time, there was no one at King's. But there's lots of philosophy of physics in London. Oxford's just down the road. It was actually an intense...
so much happening. I could imagine. Well, wonderful. Okay, so... so after a few years of some opportunities for some great postdocs, so tell us a little bit about moving into your lecturer position.
Yeah, so then my second postdoc was actually at King's. So, so I got a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship at King's, which is a lovely 3-year postdoc with a bit of teaching. So you're meant to do a bit of teaching for the institution, but it's meant to be career development, and it's half funded by the Leverhulme and half funded by the institution. So you have to kind of wait for someone to advertise one of these things. It's sort of a grant, but it's not quite a grant you take with you. So King's were advertising, and I said, okay, well, I'd love, jobs in London sound good. So I applied to that and got it. And had almost never even walked, I haven't been in London for 2 years, I'd almost never walked into the King's department. It was sort of, as it happened, wasn't doing very much philosophy of science, philosophy of physics at the time. And David Papineau was very much there as a philosopher of science, but mostly doing kind of mind metaphysics stuff. And it hadn't been kind of on my kind of regular beat in London. But I actually loved the department. I just thought it was an incredibly wonderful, friendly place, and had a lovely time doing a postdoc there. And while I was a postdoc, King's had a physics and philosophy degree that really wasn't functioning properly. And so kind of while I was there, started doing philosophy of physics for the people on that degree. And then at one point the physics department said they wanted to cancel the degree. And I kind of came in for crisis meetings and told them, no, we'll reform the degree so it's better and all of this. Nice. So kind of ended up more involved in the teaching side of things than I might have been as a postdoc at King's. But that turned out to work out really, really well for me, because it turned out that, unbeknownst to me, there's a clause in the Leverhulme grant that you get, which says that basically the university has to be open, has to have a track where they could allow funds for making you a permanent lecturer at the end of.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah,
they don't have to do it, but there has to be a potential career track that they've created. So once I'd done, it was all a little bit more stressful and a little bit more tenuous than this, and I was applying for other jobs in the process, and
of course,
it wasn't quite as automatic as this sounds. But actually, once I had kind of done this thing where I'd said, well, we need to reform this degree, and King's is going to need it. Basically, I'd created a situation where King's was going to need a philosopher of physics around. Then my department realized that they could, in fact, basically apply for a tenure track, the UK equivalent to a tenure track line for me. Wonderful. So I was given my job. I didn't really apply for it, which again, so when I say I've been extremely lucky, there's an awful lot of luck in there. In the meantime, I was applying for, I was very lucky because I usually got jobs before I was so desperate for them.
Right. There's not a, sure.
I was applying for nice jobs in the meantime, and it wasn't that like people were offering me every prestigious job out there on a plate at the same time. So again, just kind of slightly, and I applied for some jobs in London that did come up, and was devastated when I didn't get them, because I thought those
feels like the perfect job
that are ever going to come up in London. Now we definitely have to move, halfway around the world for whatever job I do get. And then in the end, this happened. So that's how I ended up where I am, and I've been there ever since.
So I've talked with David Papineau back in the day. I think we had an interview several years ago. But tell us a little bit about what's King's is like for philosophy of science. What are its specialties? What's the faculty like? What are the students like? From what you've spoken about, the really interesting developing that undergrad program sounds really, really something. And it's something that I want to think about maybe going forward for just like other places, considering like doing, a little bit of that elsewhere. I think it would be really interesting. But yeah, tell us a little bit about, your experience there and what it's like.
The undergrad program has its most direct impact on, hopefully the grads in it, but me, because by having a physics and philosophy joint program, I and now Alex Franklin, who's also a philosopher of physics, who now works at King's too, so there's two of us. There's an awful lot of philosophy of physics we can teach. So we're lucky in that we can do an awful lot of our teaching load right in our areas of specialization. And that's kind of fun, and we have lots of leeway to do interesting things and things that excite us in the teaching space. So that's nice. So King's is a really big department. It's like 30. I haven't counted us at the moment, but we're around about 30 philosophers, not counting temporary people and postdocs and all the rest of it. So that's certainly by UK standards big, and I think pretty much by anywhere a big department. And it's super diverse, and it's historians, and it's metaphysicians, and it's ancient philosophers and philosophers of science and philosophers of language. So very, very diverse and quite cohesive within that. So there's a really big belief that everyone should be able to talk to each other, which is surprisingly wonderful, actually. Suits me as a philosopher of physics a lot. So King's always said they didn't know that they could have a philosopher of physics. So they thought the philosophers of physics wouldn't talk to them. And I like chatting about more or less any area of philosophy. So that's been really fun. It's incredibly warm and friendly department. And I'm going to add, we have 2 jobs going at the moment. So do you?
So
fantastic. If there's any grad students listening to this, it's a wonderful department and you should apply. One's in history of philosophy and the other's in political philosophy. So maybe not so relevant to philosophy of science listeners, but yeah. So King's had a philosophy of science tradition. It had actually absorbed Chelsea College in London, which used to be the big philosophy of science centre in London.
Oh, interesting.
Until I think the late 80s, I believe. So, David Papineau used to work there. It's where Michael Redhead was, and a lot of philosophers of physics, like Harvey Brown, Frank Arnsenius, did their PhDs at Chelsea College in London. And that department had been closed down and been basically incorporated into King's back in, I'm going to get the history wrong, but I think back in the late 80s. And so King's had a really strong tradition of philosophy of science, but that a kind of people that were retiring and it was slightly dying out when I first arrived. David Papineau is very much still there, but David's a polymath and does all sorts of things, and brilliant philosopher of science, but also, but very much not exclusively so. But it has a really strong philosophy of mind and philosophy of neuroscience and cognitive science tradition. And when I got there, was just developing big philosophy of medicine programs.
Right.
So now I think we do have a kind of, a very strong philosophy of science presence. We've got this amazing philosophy of medicine program.
Right.
Lots of stuff that we're working with the psychology and neuroscience departments, and then kind of a growing group in philosophy of physics. So really fun place to do philosophy of science.
Wonderful. Well, tell us a little bit about your what you're currently working on. Other projects, either things that have maybe more recently come out, or things that you're hoping to work on. So what's happening in terms of research? So what I'm meant to be doing this year in Pittsburgh. Okay. Although I have to get, but I owe so many people so many papers. I've got to get out of the way first. But I'm meant to be writing, I'm one of these people who always says they're writing a book and never finds the time to write a book. So I'm meant to be writing a book this year on Spacetime Functionalism. So one thing that sort of happened, which has been wonderful for me, but also I have perhaps been sort of slow to take advantage of, is that this phrase Spacetime Functionalism, which, this is not, I don't accuse, it's a very obvious phrase. I think I was probably the first person to ever use it in a PhD thesis that was never published. Right? It's kind of it's so I started talking about these kinds of ideas, and then realized that was the right label for them very long time ago. And then I think, but for various reasons, wasn't very good at and I've given thousands of talks on this stuff, and I have so many thoughts worked out about spacetime functionalism, how it ought to work, and relatively few of them are actually in print, because I am bad and give talks and then don't get around to writing them up, and all of the rest of it. So I have a kind of at least a book's worth of material on how I think the spacetime functionalism project should go. And while I've been sitting on all my thoughts about this and failing to write them down properly in a way that everyone can access, lots of people have started talking about spacetime functionalism. So it's been, in philosophy of physics, it's become a kind of buzzword that quite a few people are interested in. Now, some of them mean something really different from what I mean, and there's no point in having an argument over who owns the term. But of course, some of them are kind of doing things that make contact with things I've thought about a lot, and don't have loads in print on. So the book is really just to kind of try and make sure I get out there what is, in fact, now 13 odd years of thinking about this particular issue, and just at least put on the record how I think it ought to go, while I watch lots of other people get interested in it and either kind of think about things that I think I've already thought about and that aren't a good idea, or so that's my most pressing project.
but it's a bit big and a bit intimidating because I have, just, I say, too many things I never wrote up on this that I've got to get all. So I need a year of research space to do that. So that's my main goal this year.
So by the end, hopefully by the end of this year, you'll have the book. You'll have a manuscript. Have a manuscript. Yeah. We'll have a manuscript that you can work on, piece out, maybe include all those papers that needed to come in. No. Yeah, I understand. Okay. Well, yeah, no, we'd love to, I'm sure we'd love to see it. I'm sure the folks, the other philosophers of physics who are kind of beginning to work in this idea of space. So there's this so I guess you've mentioned the spacetime functionalism. So what are sort of some of the outstanding questions that people are working on, maybe you yourself or others who, if philosophers of physics are listening to this or just others who, like what do you take to be some of the bigger questions that people are currently working on or that you hope to work on?
Outside spacetime functionalism? Outside?
Oh, no, in spacetime functionalism.
So I think, that project, I think it's really just, I have a particular view about how one should think of the functional role of spacetime. So there's sort of that and I have a particular agenda on that, and lots of people constructively disagree with that, which is actually, it's great to be disagreed with in philosophy. It gives you lots to do. So that's kind of fun. I think there's also just understanding. So I think the thing that, and this is where potentially, you could just say, look, this is just, arguing about the use of a term. But I think that there's a reason why I think that this notion is helpful, and it has a lot to do with real theory interpretation and really being constructive in how you think about new and alternative space-time theories. And it has less to do with perhaps a very traditional metaphysical thesis.
Interesting.
So part of the thought is to have a kind of flexible way of thinking about things like scale relative space-time structure, thinking that for different purposes, space-time structure could be different. So it's not the kind of project of, saying something deep about metaphysics with one true container or,
right.
And it's more interpretation and more physics driven, I think, than perhaps some metaphysical projects that could go under the same name. And so there's quite a lot to be done in trying to say why I think it's important that we think of it that way. Why I don't think it's going to be helpful to start talking about this particular project in ways that I think would kind of stymie physics practice or not help with actual kind of theory interpretation and construction. So
it's not necessarily in service of theory interpretation, or maybe it is, but you could see it being so in some way, like.
Yeah, I think so. So it sort of matters what you call space-time in a theory, because it's really important as a physics notion. So it matters for how you read off, but it matters for how you read off empirical content from theories. Right? It matters. Yeah. You make automatic assumptions about how a whole load of things will behave if you say something is a space-time. So it has this sort of, it's interpretatively important, but the interpretation then feeds into things that even an empiricist would care about. Right, so it has this kind of Janus-faced importance, and I think it's one of the reasons that the project's interesting is that it can tread that line between doing something that I do think is the metaphysics of physics. I just think that it's what a light touch metaphysics of physics.
Gotcha. So is there? So I and forgive me if my questions are kind of naive or are kind of just kind of come more novice in terms of understanding just like the tensions between, you mentioned, something that's more deep metaphysics. So are there folks out there who are, philosophers of physics who are more concerned or who are focusing more on like these deep metaphysical, that's the kind of, those are the kind of people they're talking to. That's the point they're trying to make in relation to space-time so how do you all work together? Like, is there a divide between the two groups? I hear this all the time because there is this, you have people who are doing epistemology of science, and then there's epistemologists, and then there's like, they're sometimes together, but they're kind of also not at all. So, yeah.
This is good. So I think that's exactly the current problem in this. This is a tiny area, right? Like it's the tiniest of all.
Right. There's like,
it's natural that like epistemology and epistemology of science end up with people not talking to each other. But one of the things that's happened here is you've got this, you've only got 15 people in the world interested in this, whatever it is.
That's crazy. It makes sense though. Of course.
It's a hot topic. Like it's hot, like a tiny little flame, right
relatively
over here.
Hot, yeah.
But you do have people, even within philosophy of physics, and then some stuff that's slightly more metaphysics of physics driven, and then some stuff that's driven by kind of David Chalmers has been kind of interested in spacetime functionalism in various ways, and so then some stuff that's been driven by David Chalmers' work. Right. So you've got people kind of coming at it from a whole bunch of different angles, and I don't think they're talking to each other nearly well enough or nearly enough. No, so actually, that's one of the reasons I'm very keen to have a conference on it, because I kind of want to put all these people in a room and tell them to talk to each other.
Excellent. Okay. No, that's what I like to hear. I mean, I don't know if that's always the solution, but I think it's often the solution.
We haven't tried it. It's worth trying. This is the point. Okay. I think, if not many philosophical problems are not solved by putting everyone in a room and getting them to
right.
duke it out. But if no one's even tried putting everyone in a room and getting them to duke it out, you might as well.
Yeah, I would agree. All right. Well, and I do know, so as a fellow at the center currently, you do have a talk coming up. So can you say anything about that? Or is this a planned to be determined kind of thing? I know it's a month and a half away, so this could be new stuff. So you don't have to. We could just say you have a talk coming up, and that's fine as well.
No. So actually, the talk I'm going to give at the center is about. I mean, it does connect up to everything I've been talking about, but perhaps not. Obviously, so there's some recent work by David Wallace, who's now here in Pittsburgh. Who I was his first PhD student, and he and I've worked together a lot. And so there's some work that's recently come out by him on a kind of mathematical form of structural realism, which is causing a lot of interest, but I think sort of gives me a bit of, there's a kind of nice tie-up between that and some of the things I think about intertheoretic relations and how to think about novelty and emergence in physics. So that kind of project of his has given me some new thoughts about how to think about intertheoretic relations and how to think about the kind of thing I've been doing for a while. So in fact, my talk, you can see, I should be writing a book on spacetime functionalism.
Here we go.
But that's what the talk I'm going to give is on the kind of this kind of how to think about novelty in physics theories in the context of a certain kind of structural realism.
Wonderful. Well, that will be available. I think it's on December 2nd.
December. That's why
on YouTube. I've got the calendar up. So no, so I'm just I'm sure the center would be happy. They're trying to always publicly get out just like exposure to their fellows and the center, sharing the links and things. So I'm sure people will be interested. Well, why don't we conclude? Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you consider to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
Good. So I suspect this is also the big challenge facing philosophy of science more broadly, and perhaps not just today, perhaps forever. But maybe I should say something about physics, philosophy of physics, and it's the greatest challenge in the sense of, I think, also a really interesting opportunity. So I think there's a kind of moment happening in philosophy of physics, but I think it's happening across the sciences actually a lot too. And I think it's brought about partly by cultural change and partly by things like social media, where there's an enormous amount of interest from the wider world in foundations and philosophy of everything in a way that there hasn't been, I think, in the past. And there's a kind of respectability in a lot of the scientific community to this work that's just emerging, that's been a long time coming. So in philosophy of physics, the most obvious exciting thing that just happened was that we just had a Nobel Prize awarded for foundations of physics, for stuff I teach in my philosophy of physics classes. Which was this? Which project was this? So this is the 2022 Physics Nobel Prize going to Aspect, Glauser, and Zeilinger, which is for basically experimental work on Bell's inequalities.
Wow.
Which are, super fundamental foundational results about quantum entanglement. I say my students have to derive Bell's inequalities in my classes. This is absolutely central foundational work. And, John Bell was this wonderful physicist, but also, in some ways one of the greatest philosophers of physics of the 20th century. He wasn't in mainstream physics, he wasn't well recognized or well appreciated. And the kind of work that these guys just got the Nobel Prize for, it's really, almost career-ending work at one point when they were doing it in the kind of 80s,
wow,
90s. It was so unrespectable to be worried about these things, and so it's very symbolic that we just had a Nobel Prize in foundations of physics. And I think it's part of a broader thing that's happened, which is that physicists have started to realize that they're not going to do good theoretical physics without foundational work and without thinking about the foundations and the philosophy of physics. And so now a lot of physicists are really interested in these questions and really interested in talking about them, communicating them. And that, of course, there have always been physicists like that, but there are more, and it's mainstream and it's respectable. And there's an opportunity, but also I think for philosophers a big challenge to actually get into that conversation and say, wait, this is what we do, and we have expertise. And actually, we've been thinking about these things for decades, and we've been thinking about how not to think about them. We've made mistakes that you could learn from. And I think philosophers of science and philosophers of physics, perhaps in particular, are often not as good at forcing their way into these conversations as we should be. I think philosophers of physics have a kind of excessive respect for physicists, where one worries that there isn't anything we could possibly say that would be useful to the great men of physics. And actually, no matter how smart some of these guys are, they're often trying to think from first principles about a problem we've thought about a lot. And if you ever heard physicists try and debate free will, you'll realize, very smart people can say very silly things about philosophy very quickly. So I think that there's a real moment in both in kind of public engagement, but and with engagement with the scientific community at the moment, for philosophers to get onto the stage and be intellectually central and important in a way that we don't always do, and we often haven't been. It requires a whole bunch. It requires not kowtowing to scientists too much, respecting them, but respecting our own skills as well. And it requires public engagement, which I think we're often bad at, because I think philosophers want to say everything. We want to be precise, and we hate the idea of making the tiniest sort of approximation or mistake or not. And we need to be better about being happy to enter a conversation and say something that's an approximation to what we want to say for the sake of keeping the conversation going. But I think that if we do that, there's a really interesting opportunity to have some of the things that we do have much more impact on the sciences than they have in the past. And I think that's an exciting one.
That'd be wonderful. No, I appreciate that. No, this is probably the most optimistic, opportunist, response I've ever heard. I mean, this is great. Like, I understand it's a big problem, but it just it provides a real good path forward. I have a lot.
You wanted the response where I say philosophy of science. It's all in the doldrums. Everyone's asking the wrong questions. I can give. No,
I don't. I want this. I'm very happy about this. I mean, usually it's just, I don't know. Like, this is just like these interviews kind of end on a down note, essentially, because they're like, yeah, well, this is just like the new. I mean, I'm just really happy to hear about success. Well, so I am interested about. So you mentioned, is there any relevant distinction to be made between foundations of like physics versus philosophy of physics? The term foundations is it's just but is there something
there is a distinction, and foundations of physics is what you call it when you want to say that you could be doing it in the physics department.
That's what I'm getting at. Yeah
and therefore there is a difference in how people do it. I mean,
right,
so there are bits of philosophy of physics that could never have been called foundations of physics. They're very much, and they're good bits, they're important. They might be in straight philosophy of science or straight metaphysics informed by physics. And There are bits of foundations of physics done by physicists that would be very unlikely to ever be done by a philosopher, where they really are first order physics research. But then there's a whole bunch of stuff in the middle where there's a lot of information to be had and a lot to be learned from the two skill sets coming together. And so usually philosophers of physics call their work foundations of physics when they want to emphasize that they want to communicate with physicists. And
that's what I was wondering. I'm like, well, how could, if you foundations of, these other things, foundations of biology, foundations, like, I'm wondering, is it a way of, communicating or like successfully connecting? Because people do feel more, the word philosophy scares people. Like it does, like scientists in particular. And so I was thinking about how to get people together and
the word foundations of physics has been useful in that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because people think we're going to talk to them about like quantum consciousness or something. If you say right. And foundations of physics often does a better job of actually, many physicists, if they ever look at mainstream philosophy of physics, are surprised by how relatively physicsy it is, right?
That's great. Yeah.
And I mean, they might be horrified by bits of it, but they're
right.
You think, well,
that's okay.
Look, these problems that people are working on are just adjacent to what you do, and I think that's often surprising to physicists who don't know about it. So I think the word foundations helps. It certainly hasn't succeeded wonderfully in bringing the two communities together, but it's the start of a kind of a conversation that suggests we might be working on the same kinds of problems.
Great. Well, Eleanor, Dr. Knox, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate you coming on and getting to chat a little bit about your work, about your story, continuing story on to the completion of this new book that eventually will come to be. And I hope I get to say hello when we're in. Well, definitely, we'll be here for this year in Pittsburgh. Will you be at the PSA this year as well? I
will. It's in Pittsburgh, so
we'll be physically there. So that's going to be
hard not to be.
No, not at all. And this is, and also just research. Will you be teaching at all, or it's all research for the center? Correct.
This year is all research.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. Well, it's like I said, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch. Have a good rest of your Monday.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.